book you do talk in the first part of the book you talk a lot about, well, actually throughout it, but in the first part of the book you talk a lot about the suppression of dopamine. This new medication, I guess it came out late last year, or the FDA approved it late last year. Am I saying it right? Cobenfy.
Cobenfy or Cobenfy.
Cobenfy. What is your opinion on Cobenfy? Is this going to be a helpful medication, or are we looking at it kind of wrong as trying to medicate this way?
Well, it's too new to tell, just how effective it's going to be. It takes years to really get a sense of how a medication is doing. But I will say that even though in the long run it does the same thing as the older meds, it goes about it from an entirely different way.
Mhm.
So all the meds that we use for schizophrenia block dopamine. Why? Because they have this huge surge of dopamine. This medication doesn't block it, but it uses another chemical, acetylcholine, to suppress the dopamine. And what we're hoping is that it's going to have fewer side effects,
Mhm.
great efficacy, and a good other option for schizophrenics. Psychiatry is in the dark ages. Our medications don't work well enough, and they are so full of side effects. These antipsychotic medications can cause permanent neurological damage in some cases, intense weight gain with type 2 diabetes, drooling, seizures, something called neuroleptic malignant syndrome, where you get very sweaty and stiff, and your kidney tests go way up. All of these things, and we don't know which medication is going to help which person. So there's a constant trial and error. So we're hoping that this will be an improvement, but the ultimate thing that it does is essentially the same as what the old meds do, but gets about it from an entirely different direction. But every mental illness we have has to do with the desuppression of dopamine, not just schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, anxiety disorder. It's all a desuppression of dopamine that comes back at us because some people aren't quite at the point that others are, in that they can suppress dopamine as they learn language. So we know what's causing this, but psychiatry is ignoring it. They refuse to look at evolution at all as a cause of mental illness whatsoever.
Why do you think that is?
I think that they are so fixed in their research protocols that they're like gophers. They're digging through a tunnel, and they just keep going and going, hoping they find an answer without ever sticking their heads up, to look, where are they?
Mhm.
Talking about something like mental illness without looking at evolution is like putting a bicycle together without the pedals. It may look good, but you're not going to get very far. And this geneticist named T. Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology can be understood except in the context of its evolution. And that is so true, but yet orthodox psychiatry refuses to look at it. They just duck their heads and don't want to have anything to do with it. So I'm kind of a lone wolf in this effort to get things to change. And what I'm hoping is that people with mental illness, bipolar, major depression, anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, go to their providers and ask them, what is the connection between evolution and mental illness? And if the answer is, I don't know, give them the book. First you read it, and you
Yeah.
give it to them, because that's the only way this is going to change, when they see that their patients are
Mhm.
demanding better answers. And that's why I wrote the book. I was not satisfied with the answers that we had to give our patients about mental illness.
'Cause you still work with, schizophrenic, bipolar
Well, I
patients.
just retired in February, but for 40 years I worked with every diagnosis in adults, not
Mhm.
kids. And I've treated thousands of patients. I've
Mhm.
mentored hundreds of students. I was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry in the Brooklyn VA for a while and taught at the medical school, published a few papers. But
Mhm.
this is different. I have to make a change in orthodox psychiatry's perception
Mhm.
of what mental illness is. And that's not easy, but they have to start looking at evolution.
I mean, we're dealing with maybe the worst houselessness, homelessness, whatever ness you want to put on there, crisis we've seen, right? There's an 18% uptick. I mentioned it in the opening of the show. And the majority of people that you're going to deal with, if you work in services, I don't know what type of people you were working with. I worked for a time in homeless services before I came here to Mexico. So I'm not Dr. Jason. I was just the dude that was on the ground, right?
Right.
Um, and there was a lot of trauma that people experienced. I mean, losing your home is traumatic, right? Being ripped from your parents is traumatic. And there tons of people have that story, right? They got taken away as kids, grew up in foster care, then got thrown out because they aged out and maybe been on the street ever since. There's a lot of people like that. Is this trauma related?
Schizophrenia?
Mm-hmm. Can
No,
be.
it's
No.
entirely due to evolution.
Okay.
Now, there are some things that increase your odds,
Mm-hmm.
like if you're born in winter months, if you grow up in an urban area, if you have an elderly father, those increase your risk. If you have first degree relatives like parents, aunts, uncles, brother, sister, who
Mm-hmm.
have schizophrenia, your risk increases. That doesn't mean it's a genetic illness or a trauma related illness. It's entirely due to the evolutionary moment that we're in. And I want to make that very clear. 20,000 years from now, there will be no mental illness. We're still in an adjustment phase. Now, homelessness is a complex issue.
Yes.
Some of it is due to schizophrenia. And one thing that schizophrenics have is called anosognosia. They're not aware that they have an illness. And it takes years and years of working with them to impress upon them that they do have a mental illness. So we're sitting in offices treating patients who don't understand that they're ill with medications that don't work well, that we don't understand, treating patients we don't fully understand. And I'm trying to change all that. If we could look at evolution's role in creating all this, stigma would go down. Now we understand what we're treating,
Mm-hmm.
stigma would go down. Schizophrenia is 1% of the population worldwide. That's 3.5 million in this country alone. But do you
Mm-hmm.
ever hear about schizophrenia? No, it's entirely under the radar. Why? Because there's so much stigma involved with schizophrenia and all mental illness.
Yeah.
People don't want to talk about it. But think of all the family members affected, the
Yes.
patients, the caregivers, everyone. We've got to start talking about this and bringing it out into the open now that we have an explanation for it. But psychiatry wants to go along with no real explanation. When families ask a psychiatrist, well, what is schizophrenia? You just said my daughter has schizophrenia. What is it? Well, it's a chemical imbalance. Or
Mm-hmm.
they'll say, well, it's connectivity in the brain, or it's genetics. These are catchphrases that don't mean anything. If
Mm-hmm.
you read my book, you will see the real explanation for what schizophrenia and mental illness is and why we're seeing it at this point in evolution. And not just mental illness. As I said, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Tourette's, all these are dopamine related illnesses. We have to look at this. And I believe if we can look at it, there's great optimism for change. We can change our research protocols. We can reduce stigma. We can make better medications. Maybe Cobenfy is going to be a big step up. Let's hope. It's too early to tell, but we'll have much better chance of doing all this if we really understand who the patients are that we're treating and why they have the illness.